Well, it's 12 o'clock, so we're going to get started. Welcome, everyone. Thanks for joining us today for this webinar on fraud trends across the UK, what accountants need to know, hosted by PFP. We're absolutely delighted to have leading experts on this subject, Karen Edwards and Holly Thompson, as our guest presenters. If you have any questions, we invite you to please post them in the Q&A section, which is the icon on the meeting control bar. And the slide deck for this presentation will be circulated as a PDF document to you tomorrow. My name is Andrew Kilgore. I'm part of the leadership team at Geo Underwriting, where PFP sits as a specialist brand. As you may be aware, PFP works with many of the UK's largest accountancy firms, as well as thousands of small and medium-sized practices, offering the UK's leading fee protection scheme, protecting your clients against HMRC tax investigations with comprehensive cover and expert tax advice. As a specialist brand of Geo Underwriting, PFP is also part of the wider Ardonna Group, one of the world's largest insurance distribution platforms and a top 20 global insurance broker with over 12,000 employees in more than 250 locations. Now, let me introduce our guests, Karen Edwards and Holly Thompson. Karen is a director at BDO's London office, bringing over 25 years of post-qualification accountancy experience to the table. For the past 18 years, she has honed her skills in forensic accounting, specialising in investigations, litigation support and expert witness work, collaborating closely with solicitors and barristers. She has led international investigations in the USA, Africa, Switzerland and the Caribbean, frequently attending court and depositions in some of these regions. She is a key contact at BDO for fraud investigation matters and designing and delivering anti-fraud and fraud awareness training across various sectors. Holly is an assistant manager at BDO with over 8 years of experience in financial services. She is part of the specialist forensic team, where she's involved in a wide variety of forensic assignments, including international arbitrations, fraud investigations, fraud risk management assessments, audit quality review response assistance, and specialist audit support. I'm confident this is going to be a very interesting webinar. So Karen and Holly, over to you.
Thanks so much, Andrew. We are delighted to be here to share our insights. But first, let me take you through what we'll do from our agenda. And forgive us if we seem like we're rushing, because we know there's time constraint. I will outline the learning objectives first, and then we'll define fraud and explore models explaining fraud risk factors. Then we'll examine current UK fraud trends, and then discuss the fraud track and fraud survey and their findings to date. We'll also cover what accountants need to know about fraud awareness. We'll identify internal and external fraud risks and the accountant's role in spotting anomalies and red flags. We'll also explain fraud risk assessment and how it is conducted. We will explore tools and techniques for fraud mitigation. Alongside that, we'll discuss actions to take and avoid when suspected or identified fraud occurs, from responding to reporting. We'll then review a case study to show how accountants can identify potential fraud risk. And then finally, we'll conclude with 10 key takeaways. So what are our learning objectives today? So we're going to take you through spotting common frauds, both inside and outside your organization, how you grasp the impact that fraud can have, how to act as accountants when fraud is suspected or confirmed or identified, using practical methods to prevent, detect, and report fraud. And finally, and most importantly, how you foster a culture of honesty and responsibility as accountants. So next, before we go into details of a webinar, it would be good to find out about your fraud experience. If you can see the screen, there are interactive questions and there's a QR code. So if you could scan this QR code and answer the questions before we go on so we understand the audience that we have today. Go ahead. Let us know if you're having any issues with the QR code, please. Okay, so it seems majority of us here today have had experience with fraud. So we'll consider it from that aspect and also consider it from those who have not. So based on the fact that some have not, Holly will now take you through what is fraud. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Karen. So what exactly is fraud? So fraud, as defined by the Fraud Act 2006, is a criminal offence that can be committed through three different methods. Firstly, false representation. So this is any representation, express or implied, which is known to be untrue or misleading. Second, a failure to disclose. This is a failure to disclose any information when under a legal duty to disclose it. And thirdly, an abuse of position. So this is whereby a person occupies a position of trust and is expected to safeguard the financial interests of another person. There are two key elements of fraud that need to be proven, and these are dishonesty, and that it is not a mistake or error, and also intention, and that the perpetrator must intend to gain for themselves or another, or to cause loss or expose another to risk of loss. Fraud can be committed internally by an employee. For example, this could be employee fraud or financial misreporting. Equally, it could be committed externally by a third party. For example, supplier fraud or customer fraud. Karen will now take you through two different models that can be used to explain the factors that lead to fraud.
So theoretically, there are two models that are used to explain the factors that lead to fraudulent behavior. The fraud triangle, which is on the screen, and the fraud pentagon. These are models explaining why fraud occurs. First, I will consider the fraud triangle. So first thing to think about is opportunity. That is the chance to commit fraud without detection, often due to weak controls or oversight. Then there's pressure. So that's the motivation of the person to commit fraud, such as financial stress or unrealistic targets that are set for financial reporting. And lastly, there's rationalization. So the fraud perpetrator has something within them that justify the fraud they're committing, like believing it's harmless or that whatever they are taking, they deserve it. For example, an employee facing financial difficulties might exploit their finance role to steal, and they may rationalize it as insignificant because they work with a large company. So the fraud pentagon. So that just expands on the fraud triangle by adding two additional components. So we spoke about opportunity, pressure, and rationalization before. So the next two that's adding is competence. So what competence speak about is having the skill and knowledge to commit fraud. Like, think about it. If someone has IT expertise to exploit systems, it may go undetected. And then arrogance, the final of the pentagon. It's the belief of being above rules, leading to more daring, fraudulent actions. We tend to find this in companies where the CEO has a very heavy hand in the process. But understanding these components, whether it's from the fraud triangle or the fraud pentagon, helps organizations create effective fraud prevention and detection strategies. So just to keep you awake, just in case we're boring you, I have another question. What are the three components of the fraud triangle? Let's see who's been listening. Again, scan the QR code. Excellent, even though we've only had one response so far. So I think I've given the answer away by saying excellent. So yes, it is opportunity, pressure, and rationalization. So what Holly will now do is take you through an overview of the UK fraud trends and some of the statistics that we are seeing as practitioners. Over to you, Holly.
Thanks, Karen. So one of the most prominent statistics that has come out recently is that the National Crime Agency estimates that fraud accounted for a huge 41% of all crime in England and Wales in the year ended September 2024, which is a really quite significant statistic. The two high-level trends emerging from an analysis of data over the past decade are that the number of reported cases of fraud is increasing, and also that the amounts involved are getting bigger too. This is only likely to continue with new fraud growth areas such as ESG and tax, and with the opportunities which AI brings. However, this does contrast with the findings of the BDO Fraud Track 2024 report, which found that fraud had actually fallen to £550 million from £2.3 billion the year before, which was in line with a general 5-year downward trend. However, preliminary data from the 2025 Fraud Track report would suggest that fraud is set to increase again this year. And we must also keep in mind that the BDO Fraud Track operates based on reported cases in the public domain, therefore creating an inherent experience gap. Moving on to consider UK fraud trends in some more detail, we can take a look at the most recent government response. So in November 2020, the government asked the Common Law Commission to explain why it was disproportionately difficult to prosecute large companies for economic crimes committed in their names, and to assess the different options for reform. In June 2022, the Law Commission published a paper examining options to improve the law to ensure that corporations are effectively held to account for committing serious crimes. The Economic Crime and Corporate Transparency Act 2023, otherwise known as ECTA, implemented the proposed options and received royal assent in October 2023. The failure to prevent fraud offence came into force on 1st of September 2025 and places important new obligations on employers who are large organisations to take steps to prevent fraud. The consequences of getting it wrong could result in your organisation receiving an unlimited fine. So the purpose of the Act is to strengthen the UK's response to economic crime and improve corporate transparency. Therefore, the goal is to create a safer, more transparent UK business environment. A large organisation is now guilty of an offence if an associated person commits a base fraud offence and is intending to benefit either the organisation itself or any person to whom the associate provides services to on behalf of the organisation. As a result, organisations must implement reasonable fraud prevention procedures, and our specialist advisory teams can assist in ensuring that an organisation is ECTA ready. Now time for another question. What is Fraud Track? Karen will go on to explain this later in more detail, but let's get an idea of you guys first. Again, if you want to just scan the QR code. Thank you for your responses. Karen will go on to explain more on answer.
Okay, so thanks for those answers. But while I'm a little disappointed that Majority of you don't know what it is. I'm happy that almost 40% knows that it's an analysis of fraud cases in the UK. So let me tell you a bit more about FraudTrack. Since 2003, BDO has tracked UK fraud cases valued at £50,000 and more. We explore trends across industries and locations, examining fraudsters' careers, motivations, and demographics like age and gender. So BDO FraudTrack has led the way in monitoring fraud threats for over 20 years. It is cited in over 45 publications, including The Times, the Financial Times, The Guardian, and was mentioned in a parliamentary debate on cybersecurity, showing our leadership in addressing real-world issues affecting clients and society as a whole. The fraud survey, which you may not have heard about, this came about because we recognized that 2020 was tough for businesses due to COVID, with operational and financial challenges worsened by fraud threats. Therefore, we launched the fraud survey to investigate these concerns. So at the start, we surveyed 500 directors and business owners from companies with over 200 employees to understand their experiences with fraud in the current year and in the past 5 years. So the surveys examine directors and business owners' views on fraud risks, especially emerging and current socio-economic issues like post-Brexit, and of course, AI, deepfakes, that is prominent in discussion, and their future expectations and how this will impact them. Going forward, our survey this year will also consider what experience corporates have had undertaking financial investigations. So in summary, FraudTrack and Fraud Survey's main objective is to raise awareness. We're quite aware that we can't eliminate fraud entirely, but we must stay ahead of new threats. However, a proactive, collaborative approach is crucial when we look at fighting financial crime. So what did we see in 2024 in FraudTrack? Let me just take you through a little bit more details. So as Holly pointed out earlier, reported fraud and economic crime fell by 76%, almost 80% to 550 million in 2024. And this was mainly due to there were fewer high-value cases in the year that was being reported. So this decline aligns with a 5-year trend, despite in 2021, there was a spike when losses exceeded 10 billion during the pandemic. This drop highlights the growing importance of accountants in protecting businesses and enhancing financial health at a very detailed, granular level. In 2024, 3 high-value cases in the UK were reported, which totaled 371 million. Although this was a significant drop because in 2023, there were 8 cases which amounted to 1.9 billion, almost 2 billion pounds. So in 2024, the 3 cases made up about 70% of the year's total reported fraud value. These, to give you a quick rundown of what these cases were, there was a money laundering case involving 266 million through a gold trading operation. The second one was an alleged laundering of 55 million by a Chinese gang using an international network and informal money transfer system. And the last one was the Bulgarian gangs who were found guilty of a 50 million fraud by going through the DWP with fraudulent universal credit claims. In 2024, if we continue, what else happened? Money laundering topped the list of reported fraud and economic crime by value, reaching an astronomical 337 million. The average reported value of money laundering in 2024 was 20 million. a tenfold increase when we compare it to 2023, which was only 2 million. 2023 was, however, a lower value year, with 2021 seeing a high of 730 million and 2022 358 million. 2024 figures are, however, close to 2022, mainly due to the cases which I spoke about earlier. Another thing we found is that AI is a strong force in both enabling and disrupting fraud. Phishing and scams and identity theft are most common, making up over 40% of the fraud cases reported in 2024. In terms of location, London and Southeast lead, and we consider that the hotspot because it accounted for around 80%, followed by the Northwest of England, of the UK, and with 6% and Midlands with 5%. In terms of gender, men make up 78% of fraud perpetrators, with the balance being women, 22%. And the most common age group for perpetrators was between 30 and 39 years old. And all of this highlights to you a typical profile in a fraud case. So what did we see in fraud survey last year? Again, 27% of businesses reported experiencing fraud in the past 5 years, so almost a third. Almost 50% saw a reduction in fraud compared to the year before, i.e. 2023, while 9% reported an increase. External fraud rose to 42%, up from 31% in 2023. Internal fraud and collusion decreased by 3% and 8% respectively. In terms of sectors, in the professional, scientific, and technical services sectors, where we tend to fall as accountants, 22% of businesses face fraud losses, and they do not expect to recover these losses, although the loss exceeded 20% of their turnover. Whistleblowing was a top fraud detection method, responsible for almost 1/5 of the cases. Internal controls, internal auditing, fraud teams, and whistleblowing accounted for half of the detection methods. 58% of businesses expect to recover less than 10% of their fraud losses, so it represents a significant financial loss for businesses. What are these current trends showing? Asset misappropriation, cybercrime, and customer fraud are widespread. Financial statement frauds were reported last year, with ongoing investigations this year. Charities and financial services sectors frequently experience fraud. Possibly this is what's linked to money laundering. So in terms of what we are seeing in 2025. So far this year, we have seen where fraud appears to have increased by over 500 million compared to the same period last year. London and Southeast, although it has a reduction in the number of instances to 36%, but it is still the highest region, with the Yorkshire alone standing out at 34%, which again is very unusual. The most common age group for perpetrators this time is a bit older, 40 to 49, and unauthorized use or misappropriation of asset is the most common fraud type by both value and the number of frauds. This highlights the need for stronger asset management controls and oversight to protect the business from financial losses. One case of improper accounting treatment, which was just under £500,000, is particularly relevant to us as accountants. Details of this case is that a vehicle purchasing firm was found by two individuals, and their very first employee manipulated financial reports to divert funds into their personal accounts. The Typically, the fraud began with small amounts of around £200, which made it difficult to detect initially, but the payments escalated over time. Fortunately, in this case, the employee admitted to the owners and was subsequently arrested. The top 4 sectors for fraud by value so far this year are general services, which falls outside of public services, finance and insurance, professional, scientific and technical services, and public administration. The highest number of frauds that we have seen reported this year are within public administration. Holly will now take you through some further examples of recent reported fraud trends.
Thanks, Karen. So on screen, you have a very high level breakdown of some of the most high value cases that have been reported in the media so far this year. I'll take you through a brief description of the top 3. So firstly, 3 people are due to appear in court charged with money laundering offences in connection to an investigation involving an estimated £120 million worth of cryptocurrency. In terms of the role which accountants like ourselves will play in terms of frauds like this, we need to ensure that appropriate controls are in place over any element of crypto funds, similar to those that would be in place over traditional treasury methods, which we might be more familiar with. Secondly, a tech student who sold phishing kits to fraudsters to scam victims out of over £100 million has been jailed. Again, from an accountant's perspective, accountants need to ensure that supporting documentation is provided for all payment requests to ensure that they are genuine and legitimate. Thirdly, the chief executive and director of Axiom, which went bust amid allegations of a £64 million fraud, was charged alongside the firm's chief financial officer with 2 counts of fraud by abuse of position. The Serious Fraud Office alleged that they had misused client funds and exposed thousands of the firm's clients to losses. Again, from an accountant's perspective, accountants must ensure that segregation of duties is in place to avoid any abuse of power such as this occurring, and also that all of the appropriate anti-money laundering regulations and rules are properly abided by.
So
Karen?
Fraud awareness, what accountants should know. Sorry, we're aware of the time. It's almost 12:30, so we're trying to go through as quickly as possible. So what should accountants know? Legal accountability, for example, the new ECTA, which we spoke about, that introduces a new offense, failure to prevent. So large organizations face criminal liability if fraud benefits them and they lack reasonable prevention procedures. And this is where we as accountants help. The next one is reasonable procedures as a legal defense. So coming off of legal accountability, as accountants, we should design, implement, and document fraud prevention controls. Procedures must match the organization's size, risk profile, and sector, so it just doesn't appear as if it's a tick box exercise. Then there's financial oversight and risk management. So we need to watch for anomalies in transaction, for example, supplier relationships and payroll, ensure internal controls or internal audits and reconciliation are robust and frequent. In terms of culture and training, as accountants, it's good to foster a culture of integrity and transparency with a top-down approach so that those within the firm understands that it's not just a policy, it is recommended by those at the top of the organization. And a good way to do this is to support fraud awareness training for finance team and all staff across the organization. Reporting and documentation, that's there separately to emphasize that you must keep clear records of fraud risk assessment and prevention efforts because you need to be ready to demonstrate that you're compliant if you're challenged by regulators like your accounting boards or the Financial Reporting Council, FRC. So let me go into what are internal and external fraud risks. So internal frauds, as the name suggests, happens within the organization. There are so many examples, but let's look at a few. Asset misappropriation. So that describes things like theft of cash, inventory, or assets like false expense claims and payroll fraud. The next one is very relevant to us as accountants, and it's falsified financial reporting, or as we've had on the screen, financial statement frauds. And this is where accounts are manipulated to meet targets or to hide losses. Another one that's tend to be ignored is collusion, where employees work together to override controls, example, in procurement frauds, and they may collude internally or externally. Then a very famous one is ghost employees. This is where they add fake staff to the payroll to divert salaries. And last by no means least, conflict of interest. Undisclosed relationships affecting purchases or hiring decisions. And these tend to happen when there are bids, and we call that bid rigging. Then on the other hand, external frauds. Again, as the name suggests, this is done by people outside of your organization. So what are some of these frauds? Cybercrime and phishing, where you get fake emails targeting finance team to steal credentials or redirect payments. Another one is invoice fraud, where they impersonate a supplier to request payment to fake bank accounts. Procurement fraud is also an external fraud. So where vendors inflate price or deliver substandard goods. Then there's banking and payment fraud. And this is the intercepting or manipulation of payment instructions. So you'll get a request for a payment and someone put in their own bank account details rather than the legitimate payee's details. And then false financial statements. Yes, it's also an external fraud because people will submit fake documents to secure loans or contracts. And of course, money laundering, where they use your business to disguise illicit funds. So if I look into cybercrime, it's growing pretty fast. It's a big threat. If you remember, there were recent attacks on UK retailers like Marks and Spencer's, Harrods, and the cooperative food chain. And it highlights these risks that are happening. So M&S faced a ransomware attack. Harrod had restricted internet access to contain the threat because they kept being bombarded with phishing emails. And the co-op experienced supply chain disruptions. So when we look back at our 2024 fraud survey, it showed that 17% of businesses increased IT investment, 14 took steps to secure business data, 13% increased spending on fraud detection tools. So what is this saying to us? That as accountants, we must be vigilant against fraud risks to protect financial integrity, reputation, compliance, and of course, to protect our profits. Then what is your role as accountants? So some of the things that you can do is conduct fraud risk assessment, where you understand the prevalent fraud types in your sector to tailor risk management and implement targeted controls. Next, implement and monitor prevention procedures. As accountants, we are the first line of defense. So we review transactions, we monitor controls, and make sure we flag any anomalies. Promote transparency and ethical culture. Foster an environment where ethical practices are the norm. This is very important. Next is regulatory updates. We have been speaking about ECTA throughout these presentations. So ensure you are aware of any regulations and laws that have been updated so that you implement reasonable prevention procedures, conduct fraud risk assessment to ensure you have robust documentation of controls. And lastly, as I said before, maintain documentation for compliance. Keep thorough records to meet compliance requirements. Using the video fraud track report helps you understand sector-specific fraud risk across internal, external, and including financial statement areas. It offers insights into emerging threats and vulnerabilities, enabling you to proactively address potential risks and enhance fraud prevention measures within your organization. So BDO is BDO's fraud track is a very effective report that you can use to raise your awareness. So before we go on to the next section, we have another question. Do you know what are some examples of fraud red flags? You can just put a word in, there's no specific answer. Any word? Should I give an example? Okay, we've had one response. Yes, good one. Anyone else? Don't be shy, it's anonymous. Okay. So far, so good. I think these are the areas that we look into, but what Holly will do now, she will take you through how to identify anomalies and fraud red flags. Over to you, Holly.
Thanks, Karen. So when it comes to identifying these anomalies and red flags, we need to remember that people will not tell you that they are committing fraud. So we need to be on the lookout for any irregular or suspicious flags that might lead you to suspect that fraud is being perpetrated. On screen, we have a list of red flags to look out for. So please take a moment to review these. It's important to be aware of unusual patterns or behaviours that might indicate fraudulent activity. Fraud can manifest in various ways, and understanding and recognising the signs early can prevent significant damage being made to the organisation. Some of these general flags in accounting include unusual transactions, so whereby transactions are out of the ordinary, such as large cash payments or transfers to unknown accounts. We also have frequent errors, so where there might be consistent mistakes in financial records or discrepancies in accounts, which might indicate that manipulation or cover-up attempts are ongoing. Missing documentation is also another fraud red flag, as this could indicate, again, that fraudulent activities are ongoing and that the perpetrator is trying to conceal or get rid of the evidence. The final one on screen is unexplained changes. So this could mean sudden changes in financial performance or unexplained adjustments in accounts, which can be indicative of fraudulent activities. Moving onwards, we're now going to take a quick look at fraud risk assessments and the purpose of them. So a fraud risk assessment is a systematic process used to identify, evaluate, and prioritise potential fraud threats within an organisation. It helps organisations proactively manage their vulnerabilities and strengthen their defences against both internal and external threats. The key elements of fraud risk assessment processes include reviewing systems, processes, and controls, identifying areas most vulnerable to fraud and focusing our attention on them, addressing the likelihood and potential impact of different fraud scenarios, and developing strategies to reduce or eliminate those risks. This whole process is essential for building a strong and fraud resilient organisation. So, moving on to our next question. What is the primary purpose of a fraud risk assessment?
Okay.
The QR code is working for this one,
Yeah.
but it should be easier for this one. It's a choice of 4. But if no responses are coming through, then...
Okay, I'll pick up from here then,
Yes.
since that's not happening. But the primary purpose of a fraud risk assessment is to identify and mitigate potential fraud risks. So what I'll do now is take you through some fraud risk mitigation. So on the board, you'll see, on the screen, you'll see tools and techniques for prevention and detection. So anti-fraud controls are essential for business integrity and financial reporting accuracy. So preventative controls, these measures stop errors and irregularities before they happen. They ensure no single person has unchecked control, reducing fraud risk. So the key actions include establishing reasonable prevention procedures, conducting regular risk assessments, strengthening your internal controls, implementing robust financial oversight, ensuring cybersecurity and data protection are considered, document every single thing. And another one that we don't tend to consider is KYE, which is knowing your employees. What checks do you undertake before they are employed? And then detection controls. So these identify errors or irregularities after they occur. They form a strong framework to protect against fraud. Some key actions are, as you can see on the board, internal audits conducted regularly and also do them on a surprise basis. Focus on high-risk areas like procurement and payroll, or whichever is a high risk in your sector. Monitoring transactions, use automated systems to flag unusual patterns. Monitor, for example, for duplicate payments and rapid vendor changes. Reconciliations, perform them frequently for bank and payroll reconciliations. Identify discrepancies between internal and external records. Whistleblowing mechanism, provide anonymous reporting channels. A lot of people have whistleblowing mechanism, but they tend to say, go and talk to your manager. But it's best to have anonymous reporting channels and people will participate more. Also encourage a speak-up culture. Data analytics and forensic tools, for example, using forensic accounting software or applied trend and ratio analysis. Exception reporting, generate reports for transaction bypassing normal controls and review, overrides, and access logs. Third-party review, engage forensic specialists like us, where we can undertake independent assessments. Employee behavior monitoring, I saw someone put that up earlier. So you watch for lifestyle changes, which is inconsistent with income, and you track their access to sensitive systems and pay closer attention to what they do from a financial perspective. And again, we emphasize fraud awareness training. Staff should be trained to recognize and report suspicious activities. Why it matters for accountants is because we play a crucial role in early fraud detection through financial scrutiny. This supports not just legal compliance, especially under the new failure to prevent offense, but it also helps to limit financial loss and reputational damage. So just so I know, the next question is, what tool is commonly used to identify fraud risks and their controls? We're not testing you. We just want to make sure you stay awake and you're interactive with us. Hope that helps. Okay, thank you. So I see that a quarter of you think it's the fraud risk register, and you are right. Because even though our compliance checklist is there, sometimes it doesn't consider things from a fraud risk perspective. Likewise, the employee handbook. So what do we do in terms of reporting and responding to fraud? Things to do. One of the key things to do is to determine how you report and respond to frauds when they are identified or even suspected. Here are some examples of things to do, which are on the screen. You report immediately when you suspect a fraud. And you need to identify who is responsible for reporting and make sure you follow the correct procedures to report. It is important to maintain confidentiality throughout the process. You then conduct an initial assessment of the situation. You triage it. Is it a genuine case? Do it needs more investigation before you proceed? And securing evidence relating to the case is very important. And limit access to sensitive information. So you also need to notify relevant parties promptly, whether it's your regulator or the ICO, which is where you report cybercrime. Inform the fraud response team, escalate the issue to the board or regulators if necessary. Carry out or engage experts to carry out a thorough investigation, and that is what we do. Decide between the internal investigation or hiring external forensic experts. Implement response and remediation measures is the next step. So you take disciplinary action if required. So if you found that someone is suspected of committing fraud, sometimes it's good to suspend that staff. Report to the police or regulatory bodies as needed. Review and strengthen controls to prevent future occurrences. Document all actions, findings, and outcomes. Update fraud risk assessment and prevention procedures. And ensure there's legal compliance with requirements such as the Companies Act, the Bribery Act, the Procedure of Crime Act, and of course the most recent ECTA, which introduced the failure to prevent offense. So the next I'm going to show you quickly of things not to do when you identify or suspect that there's fraud. Do not ignore red flags. If you notice unusual transaction or discrepancies, do not dismiss them. Do not confront suspects directly. Avoid directly accusing individuals without evidence. This could lead to legal issues and potentially compromise the investigation. Share allegations publicly. Do not do that. Keep any suspicions confidential, because publicly sharing allegations can damage reputations and hinder the investigation. Do not delay reporting. Report any suspicions or evidence of fraud immediately. And also, finally, and most important, do not assume someone else will handle it. Take responsibility for reporting your concern. Do not rely on others to act, as this can lead to inaction and further issues. So Holly will now take you through a case study very quickly, which considered some interesting occurrences with a startup online payment processes company.
Thanks, Karen. So whilst I'm going through this, just keep in mind the fraud risk triangle, which we discussed earlier in the presentation, as we'll review the different factors which come into play from this example of a case study after I've spoken through it. So the case study we have here is for a high growth online startup payment processing company. So the entity is the building software and code that will allow payments to be made using every social media app in major currency and cryptocurrency. It's funded by a consortium of private equity groups, and when the product is ready, it anticipates the biggest social media platforms to be its customers. The entity is planning an IPO when it obtains approval from the FCA, and the investors are pushing for this IPO to be in early 2026. The entity currently has no revenue. The risk of fraud in revenue recognition has been rebutted. Funding is provided from the consortium subject to progress reports from the board, and the value of the product is measured by the intangible asset on the entity's balance sheet, which is currently valued at £8 million. The entity capitalises its development costs, which largely comprise of payroll costs. It has a large team of software developers and programmers, and these salaries are 100% capitalised. The payroll costs of these staff are capitalised according to the estimated percentage of time spent on project work. Non-developer payroll costs were £2 million in the year. The entity tries to keep its overheads low by not having physical premises. Instead, it works on a fully remote basis, with the team being spread across the UK and with limited day-to-day oversight. It also has an unsophisticated accounting system. In order to test its payment systems, the entity has holdings in over 200 currencies and cryptocurrencies, certain of which are obscure, niche, and not very well known. The Treasury team conducts its own research every 6 weeks into the market prices of these currencies. Lastly, the development team has informed us of a significant defect in the product. Management tells us that the developers are perfectionists, not commercially minded, and that the supposed defect has not been included in the FCA application as it is a trivial issue. The key points are summarised on the screen, and we'll give you just a few seconds here to review them. Karen, I'll hand over to you now to review how to apply these from a fraud triangle perspective.
Okay, if you recall, we spoke about the fraud triangle earlier. So if we look at opportunity, for example, they have the opportunity to exaggerate progress made because funding is provided from the consortium, which is subject to progress reports, which mean they can manipulate them. Another opportunity is that they use judgments to understate expenses because payroll costs of staff are capitalized according to estimated percentage of time spent on project work. They have the opportunity to manipulate due to control weaknesses because of unsophisticated accounting systems. They also can use their judgment to overstate intangibles as funding is based on progress report and their value of intangibles. To overstate cash is another opportunity, as for example, as a treasury team conducts its own research into market prices of its cryptocurrency holdings, which can be manipulated. I'm conscious of time, so I'm going to go pretty fast. So in terms of pressure, there's a going concern, which is contingent on progress because funding is provided from the consortium subject to progress report. There's also pressure to unlock funding. And the other main pressure is to get FCA approval and the IPO that investors are pushing for. In terms of rationalization, they can rationalize their actions simply because they do not want to derail the operation. So there are some other startup scandals, such as Theranos, which is reported in the press, which is a good example of a case where you can consider how to apply the fraud triangle or fraud pentagon that we went over earlier. So it's a wrap from here. So what are the 10 key takeaways that we considered? So we have done an overall summary on the board. So understanding fraud. Fraud is a criminal offense under the Fraud Act, and it involves false representation, failure to disclose, abuse of position. There's the fraud triangle, which is a model which explains fraudulent behavior. And then there's the fraud pentagon that does the same, but it expands on the fraud triangle, adding competence and arrogance. We looked at UK fraud trends, that they are rising with larger amounts involved. Government response, we spoke about ECTA, where they are trying to promote more large organizations to be held accountable for preventing fraud with significant fines for non-compliance. We spoke to you about our products, Fraud Track and Fraud Survey, which monitors fraud in the UK, while the Fraud Survey considers business experiences with fraud to help raise awareness and to guide prevention strategies. Then we looked at fraud detection methods. We pointed out that whistleblowing, internal controls, and audits are key in detecting frauds. Fraud risks are both internal and external, and you must be vigilant against these threats. Then we spoke about fraud risk assessment, which is a systematic process to identify and prioritize fraud threats, helping organizations strengthen their defense against potential risk. And last, and by no means least, immediate reporting and proper procedures are crucial when fraud is suspected. Confidentiality and thorough investigations are essential to resolving issues. So all these points provide a comprehensive overview of fraud, its detection and prevention strategies, emphasizing the importance of proactive measures and awareness. And that covers our webinar for today. Sorry, we're running out of time, but of course, feel free to contact us if you have any question or face any issues whatsoever with fraud or fraud risk. Thanks very much. Over to you, Andrew.
Karen and Holly, thank you so much. That was absolutely fascinating. I'm sure there'll be a lot of questions as we're running short of time. Let me just ask you one question which relates to AI. I think it's a real hot topic at the moment. You mentioned that AI is both an enabler and a disruptor. We know that AI is evolving at a rapid pace. So what will be the impact of AI in the future? Presumably it will make it more difficult to detect fraud, but perhaps also easier to prevent fraud. Do you have any thoughts on how the evolution of AI is going to impact fraud?
So as you correctly said, and remember that we said it's also a detector and an enabler. So from our point of view, it can be also used as a powerful tool in fighting fraud, because it can be used to analyze large volumes of data very quickly. It identifies patterns and detect anomalies that might indicate fraudulent activity. For example, our forensic technology team uses one tool called BrainSpace, which is part of a software that we use called Relativity. And what it does, it manages and analyzes large volumes of data, particularly in the investigation and compliance context. But by integrating BrainSpace, which is an AI tool, we leverage advanced features to enhance data analysis, improve efficiency, and gain deeper insights during e-discovery and investigation. So what AI does is combine ways in which teams can work smarter and faster and deliver better results, because through AI learning what we do, it can look beyond what we as mere humans can do. So it is a good way to fight fraud. Sorry.
Wonderful. Thank you, Karen. Well, we've reached 1 o'clock, so we're going to bring it to a close here. Thanks to everyone for joining. There was a question about the slides. Yes, we'll be sending out a copy of the slides to everybody tomorrow. If you do have any other questions, please reach out to us. If you'd like to know more about PFP's market-leading products, you can do the same and reach us on salesteam@pfp.uk.com. Thanks, everyone, for joining us today, and we hope to see you again very soon. Thank you.
Thanks very much.
Thanks all.